Britain is broke, we're told.
Yet another fiscal black hole.
We have a gaping hole in our finances that seems to be growing by the day. And if we don't want to completely gut the state, we need to find money now. One option, tax the rich. A wealth tax. The public likes it. It could raise billions. But as with anything that involves the word tax or the wealthy, it's also massively controversial.
This is a tax on all of our constituent savings, on their houses, on their pensions. It would be a tax on aspiration.
According to some, it would be a total disaster that would scare away investors and send our millionaires fleeing in droves. Are they right? We'll see. Okay, so a wealth tax is a tax on everything a person owns. So money in the bank, property, the art collection, the yacht, minus any debts that they owe. You could charge this tax every year or as a one-off surprise. So why would we do this? As mentioned, we need money. The government is facing a fiscal hole that just seems to keep on growing, and this could help fill it. In 2020, a team of over 50 international experts on tax policy suggested that a one-off 5% tax on individuals with net worth over 2 million could raise £80 billion. In theory, if you brought the threshold down to households with assets over 1 million, you could raise 260 billion. Another argument for doing this is what I guess you could call the fairness argument. The wealth of the super rich has exploded in recent years, while the middle and working classes has stagnated. Today, the richest 1% in the UK own more wealth than the bottom 70% combined. Whatever your opinion on inequality as a moral issue is, I think most of us can agree that the extremely wealthy shouldn't be paying less tax than the working and middle classes, but that is exactly what's happening. If, like most people, you pay the bills by going to work every day and receiving a salary, you could be paying up to 45% of that in income tax alone. If you're a billionaire though, your effective tax could amount to as little as 0.3% of your wealth. I'll talk a little bit more about why this happens later, but to put it simply, income from labour or work, aka what most people do, is taxed much more heavily than income from assets, which is where the wealthy and the super wealthy get most of their income. Okay, so the final argument for the wealth tax. Politically, it's popular. 3/4 of Brits say they back a 2% tax on wealth above 10 million. And the most comprehensive survey ever done on this, back in 2020, showed the wealth tax was easily the most popular tax of all the options for fixing the public finances. Okay, there are some very legitimate caveats to the wealth tax idea. But before I get into those, I just want to address one thing, which is how any proposal that involves taxing the rich inevitably gets spun by some parts of the media into a tale of how it's going to destroy the economy by causing millionaires and billionaires to leave our shores in droves.
10,000 millionaires have already left the UK.
We've already seen the highest outflow of millionaires, the highest outflow of non-doms, the highest outflow of actually just any kind of hard-working person deciding to leave the country.
Now, you might not particularly care about whether billionaires want to live in the UK, but the point is, if they don't live here, then we can't tax them. There's also a perception that these people are business leaders and entrepreneurs. They're providing jobs for thousands of people, so if they leave, we lose all that, and the economy more broadly is going to suffer. But in the UK, most billionaires are rich not because they built up firms that create jobs for people, but instead, they're rich because they inherited, they have massive property portfolios, or they got their money through finance. Industries that don't really tend to give back to the wider economy that much. Anyway, just to illustrate how popular this type of millionaire leaving story is, let's go back to 2024, where a vast number of articles were churned out about how Labour's tax reform plans were about to trigger an exodus of the rich. In all this coverage, one name comes up again and again: Henley and Partners. Tax Justice UK and Patriotic Millionaires did some interesting work on this. They analysed more than 10,000, yes, 10,000 articles and broadcast segments over the year on how millionaires were fleeing the country. Almost all of them were citing this report from Henley and Partners as evidence. So who are Henley & Partners?
Henley & Partners is a unique firm that is addressing the needs of this global citizen.
Ultimately, quality of life, education, mobility, security, and tax.
They're a firm that sells golden passports to the super rich and advises governments on how to set up these schemes. In 2018, they were accused by a UK parliamentary inquiry of meddling in the elections of Caribbean nations in return for the exclusive rights to sell these golden passports, something that they've denied, and other schemes that they've advised on have since been ruled illegal. But in a way, that's a side note, because if you look at their actual data on Millionaire Flight, it actually showed that only 0.3% of them left in 2024. And when you dig deeper and you look at the articles profiling actual millionaires who said they were genuinely thinking of leaving, you see the same names coming up again and again. Even more damning is the fact that by 2025, this data has been almost completely debunked by both academics and policy institutes.
The 16,000 figure, for example, that Reem's quoted is simply an invented one, invented by a wealth management firm.
And yet, people just keep on trying to build an argument around it.
We've already seen lots of millionaires leave.
Oh, so okay, we've gone down from 16,000 to lots. That's better.
If you want to listen to someone way smarter than me just trash the methodology of the Henley & Partners report, I suggest you listen to the BBC's More or Less podcast on this. I'll put a link in the show notes where, by the way, you can find the sources to all of the studies and the stats that I've mentioned. The good news is there are studies out there with way more plausible evidence on whether taxing the super rich actually does make them leave. And spoiler alert, but they basically kind of contradict each other. So on the one hand, we have a paper by academics at Warwick University and the LSE, and that estimated that a 2017 reform on the non-dom tax loophole for the super rich likely led to just 2% of them leaving the country. But it did bring in £3.2 billion, so an overall increase of the tax revenue from this group by 84%. On the other hand, a study on the wealth taxes of several Scandinavian countries found the revenues raised were more or less eliminated by millionaires leaving. Yet another study showed that the extent to which people might change their behaviour as a result of a tax on wealth varied by a factor of 800, depending on how the tax itself was designed and what was going on in the country at the time. I know this is so boring, but it's more or less impossible to say whether a wealth tax would or wouldn't cause so many people to leave that it ends up being counterproductive without going massively into the weeds on how this particular tax is designed. But this level of nuance is more or less completely absent in most media coverage, which generally gives the impression that any tax on the rich is about as economically sane as the Great Leap Forward. Okay, so there are a few legitimate arguments against a wealth tax. Number one is that it would be hard to implement. Think about it. Every stake in a company, every dodgy modern art purchase, every Ming vase, every second home would have to be valued. The government doesn't have this data, so any system would likely rely on self-assessment, and clearly the incentive to just lie would be massive. Auditing all that would be a bit of a nightmare. The other argument is if this became a yearly tax, people really would change their behaviour to get around it. And inevitably there'd be calls for various exemptions, aka loopholes, to be introduced that would allow those who are sufficiently motivated to get around paying it. And let's be honest, when it comes to the super rich, they generally do seem to be quite motivated when it comes to getting around paying tax. This watering down with exemptions over time is a large part of what led to the downfall of many wealth taxes introduced by other countries in Europe. Most experts suggest a one-off wealth tax could be a pretty decent revenue generator if you did these four things. So, number one, charge it at a high rate so that you got less people to process, but you get more from each one of them. Number two, don't cave into the calls for various exemptions. Number three, allow people to pay in installments over several years if they have to. And number four, don't announce that you're going to do this way in advance because people will just find ways to get around it. The consensus seems to come out against the wealth tax charged every year. It would very likely be way too much hassle and people would find ways to get around it for sure. On the other hand though, how's about we just reform other extremely dysfunctional aspects of the tax system that allow the super rich to get away with such low rates of taxation? How's about capital gains tax, for instance? This tax is a gift to the super wealthy, people who don't get most of their money through wages, but from things like share dividends and sales and assets. Remember, while taxing work tops out at 45%, with capital gains you pay just 24%, and it really is the wealthiest people in the UK taking advantage of this. Less revenue is raised from capital gains tax in Liverpool, Manchester and Newcastle combined than in just one neighbourhood in London, Notting Hill.
It seems like a perfect situation.
Here's a real-world example. Last year, former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak brought in 2.2 million in earnings, of which 1.8 million came from financial investments. But he only paid 23% tax. That is the same rate as the average teacher. How? Because most of the tax Sunak paid would have been in capital gains, which at the time was charged at 20% on financial investments. If we reformed this tax to bring it in line with income tax and closed a few loopholes, we could raise £24 billion a year. That is more than the entire policing budget. Another one would be council tax, perhaps the ultimate example of where the poor pay more. For example, a home valued at 1 million is charged just 0.2% of its value each year on average, whereas a home worth 250,000, which is the average value, is charged at 3 times that rate. In 2019, council tax bills for the poorest 10% in England accounted for 1/10 of their take-home pay, but for the richest 10%, it was just 1/50th. It also might as well be called the Let's Hammer People in the North tax. For example, this bungalow in Burnley, it will pay more council tax than this £3 million mansion in Westminster. A Band H property in Burnley would pay more than double what's charged in Westminster. Why? Partly because properties have not been revalued for council tax purposes since 1991.
You can't touch this.
That was the year we got MC Hammer, Terminator 2 was the highest grossing movie, and this guy was still in power. Meanwhile, the average house was selling for just £53,000, and prices in the north and the southeast were nowhere near as wildly different as they are today. Obviously that changed.
I'll be back.
But no one actually did come back to revalue the UK housing stock. Also, places like Burnley aren't as well off as Westminster, or most of the southeast for that matter. Councils have little choice but to put up this tax to provide basic services for people. I'm just thinking out loud here, but imagine if we equalised and centralised council tax and used the surplus money from places like Westminster to fund child poverty programmes in places like Burnley, a place where in parts of the town 50% of the children are living in absolute poverty. That is a household income of less than 15,600 quid. If we're going to sum this whole thing up, yes, a wealth tax could potentially bring in tens of billions of pounds in extra income if it's well designed and a one-off. For the long term though, we'd be way better off sorting out other aspects of our blatantly unfair tax system like capital gains and council tax. Thanks as ever for watching, and if you like this, please subscribe. Let me know what you think, and if there's something you'd like me to look into, just drop me a message in the comments.